I get the honor of introducing the next two speakers. I'm Kylo. I am one of those 22 minority males working at Sport Manitoba. So it's interesting. It's interesting for me because female leadership in sport has never been really an issue. I see it all the time. So we've got great. My team is all females. Kelly Babb, who works in our games association department, is there. We have Jillian, who works with us in our Interlake region and with basketball. So I see female leaders everywhere. Susan Wamboo, Haley, Shannon, the conference. So I actually get to work and see female leadership. So the idea that we got to focus on it seems odd to me because I get to be surrounded by it all the time. But I'm also a parent of two girls. So you got to see them kick it around at some point later, kick it around. But so I also see the importance of it because I know where they need to go. So I have this. Shannon's in the room and she doesn't like when I do this. So I'm introducing Adrienne. Adrienne is a friend of our family. She is a clinical psychologist working at the Canadian Sports Center. She is a parent of a female Maddie gymnast and multi-sport. And River, her male athlete, is a hockey player currently, and so she gets to understand that role as well. She has been really instrumental in working with Sport Manitoba with our development of mental prep, female mental trainer clinicians, service providers across the province. And so she's also been very key in that female leadership role in some of those sports science areas that are male dominated. She's continued to work with and mentor and be a leader in that area for us. And so if you are looking for some of those mentors that were offered up today, I would suggest that if you ask nicely, Adrienne would be one of those mentors as well. And then the other person I get to introduce is kind of awkward, is my wife at the front. Also a friend of the family, Donna. So Donna is a former director of coaching at Athletics Canada. She was the executive director for Athletics Manitoba. Just recently resigned from being the executive director of Racquetball Canada to start up a company which is going to sort of be the theme of the discussion, I think, that her and Adrienne worked a lot on, humans at work. They talk about maximizing performance while still recognizing that there's humans in the middle of how we perform, not only from an athletic perspective, but from a leadership perspective and from a workplace perspective. And so that'll be your session leaders for the day, Adrienne and Donna.
It's lit up. I hear you. Oh, okay. Well, we'll just pretend it's on then. All right. No, I don't. So I'm the Adrienne of the introduction, and this is Donna, and we're kind of like partners in crime, and we have lots of fun hanging out. And so when his presentation was happening, it should say Donna as well, I suppose. Oh my gosh, no, it's really on. Whoa, that's pretty loud now. Sorry. But yes, we're going to talk about this idea of mental well-being. Mental health is obviously a huge topic right now, and I work a lot in a high-performance environment. I work a lot with high-performance athletes, and it's becoming more present to have that conversation in high-performance sport where we talk about mental health and mental well-being. For a long time, I was kind of like the only person at the table who kept on saying, I think it's important, and a lot of people actually told me that it wasn't an important part of high-performance sport, actually. Oh, I know we're not. That's okay. Whatever. I'll just keep talking. And you know, and I think mental health and well-being is incredibly important, and if we do want to have a meaningful life and enjoy our lives, we have to be mentally well. I think we understand that from a physical well-being perspective. We spend a lot of time trying to keep our bodies well, we try and get sleep, we eat well, we notice when they're not well, and I think with our emotional well-being, sometimes we're a bit more judgmental about it, we don't pay attention to it, and we kind of push it aside. So, Donna and I today are just going to hang out and chat with you ladies, and I see a gentleman in the back. and that's cool as well. A couple gentlemen. So yeah, we're gonna hopefully have like an honest conversation with each other and just figure some stuff out. There's a few themes that I'll talk about based on some things that I've learned around mental well-being in my work with high performers such as athletes and coaches. We have some strong female people up here. Actually, we have a Miss Chantal Van Lantigen, and Chantal's a pretty awesome dude. She was in Rio and was part of the first medal for Team Canada. And she's currently actually doing her PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Manitoba, and she's having a huge impact on kids and people already. So that's pretty amazing. We have Miss Kelsey Wog here. Kelsey Wog, actually, we can check in later and see how she did. They're starting a professional swimming league down in the US, and so people are selected for teams. And today is the first day they're doing the races, and apparently it was live streamed at 1 according to our coach. So we'll look later to see how she did today. But Kelsey is one of our swimmers that's trying to get to the Olympic Games. We have Miss Skylar Park here. Skylar Park's trying to get to the Olympic Games for Taekwondo, and she is currently in, either Ottawa or Toronto, and then going to Vegas and Bulgaria, because that's what she does, just going around trying to get points so she can get there. And then we have Victoria Tuchinski, who's currently running at Penn State. So these are all athletes that our entire community can be incredibly proud of, because it takes a village, right? And all of these people feel so supported in our province when they do it. But I can certainly tell you the privilege that I have in my office is I get to meet with people, and they tell me honestly how they're doing. And we get to try and keep them mentally well while they try and do something pretty special. And if you think about a high performance sports setting, it's a really, really hard environment to stay mentally well in. You fail a lot, your heart is broken all the time, and there's a lot of people who have thoughts about how you should do things. So we work a lot on trying to keep people mentally well so that they can perform well, but they can also be mentally well at the end of their journey. And I think that in sport, it's, we have times and we can tell when someone's not doing well, so we have a conversation sooner. But in our everyday lives, I'm not sure we slow down enough and make sure that we're doing well. And we keep pushing through and we keep trying to make it happen, but I think it's about, being honest with ourselves, and resilience comes from that. So, to start off with, Donna and I thought that we just, we've got a few questions, we'll just get people chatting. Oh, well, there you go, there's another female. Oh my goodness, that's Leah Ferguson. Leah is an Olympic wrestler. This is Carol Wynn, you might recognize her. She was when the Olympics were, women's wrestling first made it to the Olympic Games. Carol was a gold medalist for our country, and they're very good friends, used to train together. Leah now lives here and has started a club and is doing tons of mentorship on the female side. And her Olympic trials are in December, and she'd love to represent Canada again, so she's working really hard. So we will just get you, I'm just trying to decide if we should let them stay at their tables or move them. Where did Donna go? Oh, there's Donna. But what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to pick 2 or 3 questions that are of interest to you, and you know what, we're gonna move, what the heck? It's a movement thing, this whole sport thing. So I'd like you to go and find someone in the room that you don't know that well, and I'd like you to ask them one of these questions that you're interested in and would like to hear the response from. I'd like you to do that, 3 times, 3 different questions, 3 different humans, and then we'll get you to come and find a space, and at your tables, we will be having conversations. So once you're done, if you can kind of try and cluster at tables, so you have 5 or 6 of you at the table, like this one table thing, that's just not gonna work, come on. And so we're gonna have some conversation at our table moving forward. So once you're done your meet and greet, gather at a table. You can gather with humans that you know, humans you don't know, whatever, we're open. And then we'll keep people moving around. So go talk about this stuff, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about staying mentally well. All right, have fun. All right, awesome, thank you so much. We really appreciate you guys diving into that. That's great. All right, so today we're going to talk about this idea of being mentally well. And when we talk, I think your keynote speaker is also a very impressive, athlete from our province. I was at the Oval with Donna actually last week, and they have banners hanging up for kind of their legend athletes, and it's so cool, the Manitoba presence that's there. Clara Hughes, Cindy Clausen, and you're like, wow, there's all these Manitobans, that's amazing. The 3 main things that we're going to wrap our conversation about are these 3 principles. So staying mentally well. The first part of it is knowing who you are, how you're wired, what gets in your way, what you need to be well. That's incredibly important. And once again, I think from a physical well-being perspective, we understand that. We don't judge ourselves for it. And I work with a lot of athletes and a lot of clients, and I try and spend a lot of time getting people to be very comfortable with who they are and embracing who they are, because we know they're going to be awesome if they're the best version of themselves. I'm not trying to be someone else, and taking care of yourself along the way. The other thing is dealing with the fact that you're actually a human being, and human beings work a certain way and need certain things for recovery, and you can't override that. And the last one is trying to prioritize recovery in your life. All right, so as we get started, what we need now is at your tables, you can be either in a group of 3 or a group of 2. So if you have 4 people, you have 2 groups of 2. If you have 5 people, you have a group of 3 and a group of 2. Each of those groupings will need 1 piece of paper and 1 object to write with. Pen, pencil, marker, doesn't matter. So just sort of get a piece of paper, identify who your groups are. Everyone works at different paces. So the ones that are all done that part. Within your groupings, you need to identify who's going to be your A, who's going to be your B, and if there are 3 of you, who's going to be your C. Yeah, says the driver. This is what we're doing now. So get over there. All right. Does everyone have something to write with, something to write on, and a human to do this with? Okay. Excellent. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Donna, who once again was a track coach, she's into time and things, so she's going to be on you. You're going to have 30 seconds to execute this task. And what you need to do is you 2, or you 3, are going to work collaboratively to draw a face. Now, here's what's going to happen, though. There can be no communication verbally, so we can't have any talking, can't have any, drawing, we're dragging someone's hand over. What's going to happen is the A is going to start. And it's going to be a 2-part task, so don't worry, B's and C's, you'll get to start the next round. So, the A's are going to start. And what the A is going to do is they're going to draw 1 part of a face, whatever they want to draw. Then they're going to get the other person, and B is going to draw 1 part of a face. You're going to keep going back for your 30 seconds until you draw a face together, and then we'll do part B. Okay? Everyone's ready? Here we go. And start. Your C. Okay. C or B will put down 1 letter. So everyone's listening. 1 letter, not an entire name. 1 letter. I've had this happen before. No, 1 letter. So you'll put down 1 letter. You'll push it over. They'll put down 1 letter, and you keep going back and forth until you have a first and a last name for your face. Okay? Okay. No talking. No. Ready? Go.
and Deb's tea.
John and Deb's tea. Wow. Okay. And some very, good facial hair going on for John. Well, it's very nice of John to join us. That's awesome. Okay, so we have that one. Let's look at another couple here. Okay, here's a nice one here. Okay, so who do we have here? Okay, here we have Heather Frost. Heather Frost, very nice, very nice. Let's see, do we have any over here? Okay. Oh, nice. And this is?
A demon.
This is a demon, also known as?
Lester Banny.
Lester Banny. I wasn't sure if it was Beanie or Banny. Okay. So what do we notice about all these faces that we're holding up? What do we notice about them?
They're well drawn.
I like this group. They are indeed very well drawn. They're all smiling. And they're also all very different. You know, they're very different because different people created them. And we're all different people. If we were to change the groupings up again, we get a whole different group of faces. And so as we talk about this idea of knowing who we are, it's important to recognize that we're all unique and we're all different in terms of what our needs are. And in terms of this mental health and well-being thing, I was doing a presentation once for more of a corporate group, and there was a book that I was given called Talk Like TED. And Talk Like TED looks at the most watched TED Talks, and it talks about how to give and deliver an impactful speech. And it was a very kind of scientific book based on neuropsychology, and I was quite surprised where the first chapter started. The first chapter started with the idea of, what makes your heart sing? And I was like, really? This is kind of soft, what makes your heart sing? But as I read it, it made perfect sense. And the idea was that if you're going to have an impact on an audience, you have to know what's unique about that content, what you really connect with. Because if you can understand that, and you understand what makes your heart sing, then you're going to have a better connection with the audience. So what's really interesting is day-to-day living. I'm not sure we really think about, we get up in the morning, it's like, what makes my heart sing, today? It's more like, let's get to work, let's get the lunches made, let's do this, let's do that. And then life kind of ticks away. And then sometimes we have something that happens in our life, whether it's an illness or something like that. And then we might start asking this question a little bit more and being a bit more cognizant of it, making sure we live our days kind of meaningfully and purposely. But it's a really interesting concept, this idea of what makes my heart sing. And that was one of the questions that you may or may not have chosen to ask each other. But this is kind of where you get your energy from too. If you're connected and doing things that you love, then you're going to be more mentally well. You're going to have the energy to do all the other things. And sometimes when we get kind of burnt out and worn down and we don't have energy to do stuff, it's because we haven't been doing enough of the stuff that we really, really value. And so it's an interesting idea. Related to TED Talks, there was one TED Talk with this guy. His name's Simon Sinek. And he talked about this idea of knowing your why. And I'm not going to show this video. I'll show a little clip of another TED Talk that I really like. And he was talking about if you want to sell a lot of products, a lot of people start with, what you need it for, how you're going to do it, and your why. But he's like, no, if you really want to impact them, start with your why. Start with, the why that you do things. And if people understand the why, they're going to buy it. They're not going to care about the other stuff. So that's a bit of an abstract, big concept. So I like to kind of bring it down. And once a year, I have a speaker that comes to town. And it's a Cal Lecture Series, it's called. It's in October, by the way. I think it's on the 30th this year, if anyone's interested. It's always like, I'm always sitting there going, wow, I can't believe this person came. And one year, one of my speakers that came was a cardiothoracic surgeon. So he's a heart surgeon down in the US. His name is Kurt Tribble. He used to be based out of the University of Virginia. And just an incredible person, just very, very good at what he does. And he was, during his lecture, talking about a time in his career where he was kind of not sure he wanted to be a heart surgeon anymore. He's pretty drained, pretty burnt out. And so he had to reflect a little bit on why he wanted to be a heart surgeon in the first place. And as he sat down and he thought about it, he realized, you know what? I wanted to be a heart surgeon because I wanted to help people be well. And I wanted them to be able to do things that they couldn't do when they were unwell. And then he realized, my day-to-day job, I never see that. I literally do a lot of paperwork. I'm in the OR, people come in, I do surgery, I don't touch that at all. And he realized, you know, that needs to be a part of my life more, so I have the energy to do all the other stuff. So what he started to do, there wasn't time for it. He had to like carve out the time. There's never time. What he started to do was the night before the operation, he was at the hospital doing his pre-op stuff anyways. He went up to the room where a patient was waiting for their surgery. They'd been prepped and they were waiting, ready to sleep and have their surgery the next day. So he went into the room and he said, "Hey, I'm Kurt Tribble, doing your surgery tomorrow." And apparently the patient was a little surprised. But they're like, you know, they talk, and it ended up being a really interesting conversation because he said the patients were very scared when he entered the room. You could tell by their body language. And through the course of their conversation, he could tell that they were sitting up a little bit more. And he felt that it was also having a positive impact on the patient to have this conversation. But he would talk to them about it and he'd say, "You know what? What do you want to do when you're well?" And the patient would kind of sit up and they'd say, "You know, I want to walk my grandchild to school, or I want to mow the lawn, or I want to ride my Harley again," or, you know, whatever it was that they wanted to do when they're well. And he said, "You know what? When you're doing that, can you send me a picture of that? And tomorrow when you go into the operation, what are you thinking about that?" And so if you were to steal Kurt's phone, he has a file with all the pictures of his patients doing the stuff they couldn't do when they were unwell. And then when he's in a really long meeting that he really doesn't need to want to be in, and that certainly wasn't why he trained to be a doctor, he'll look at the pictures and remind himself why he does his job. And so in our day-to-day lives, there's no one who's like, "Oh, hey, what's happening for you? What's important for you to do today?" No one ever thinks about their asset. They probably don't even know. And any job, like for all my athletes, it becomes work at some point. You know, they're not living the dream all the time, but they have to know what their dream is and they have to stay connected enough to it. So I really like the Kurt Tribble story where he, you know, sat down intentionally and he thought about how he wanted to, you know, what was important in his job that he needed to experience more so that he could, you know, do it. The middle picture is of a poem called The Dash. And The Dash is a poem that I heard at a funeral. A strong female athlete I played basketball with at the University of Manitoba, and one of my very best friends, her father had passed away. And I had gone to the funeral and this poem was read. And literally if you Google The Dash, it's a very well-known poem. I was not aware of that at the time. But the poem is very much about the year that you are born and the year that you pass away is not important. What's the most important is the dash in between. And it's the idea of how do you want to live your life and what do you want people to remember about you when you're not in the room anymore. And it's this really beautiful poem that causes you to take that step back and reflect a little bit. And the last one is of someone that I think did a wonderful job of living his dash right up until the end of his life, and that's Gort Downy. And I don't know if anyone saw the documentary that he had about the last tour that he was on. And with Gort Downy, he's someone who had lots of opportunities to get very large contracts in the US, but never did because he was a storyteller and he had a certain way he wanted to live his life with intentionality. And at the very end of his life, he wanted to go onto a tour. And he was very ill on that last tour, and his whole band member, they were like, "Oh my gosh, why are we doing this? He's dying, why are we doing this?" And one of them in the documentary, the moment he stepped onto stage, they were like, "This is where he needs to be. We're doing it because this is his place," you know? And so again, these are, you know, very kind of large concepts, but for me, knowing what makes your heart sing and what makes you tick is really important. And when I think about mental health and mental illness, there was one time years ago I was asked to write something during Psychology Month around, you know, mental health issues, and I was like, I don't know how to write about that. I wanted to write about staying well and about the process of staying well. And there's certainly genetic predisposition for like depression, anxiety, and everyone's born and wired differently. If we take good care of ourselves, we can manage it much better than if we don't and end up kind of in a really hard place at some moment. So part of that is for sure knowing what makes your heart sing. So what I want to do now is at your tables, I just want you to have a quick conversation about anything that resonated in that for you, any of your thoughts about it. Really, it's your time, so you can converse about anything that you want, but just that whole concept. So just take a second and talk with yourself about that. All right. We'll gently bring the conversation back to the room. Did someone not get a chance? I'm so sorry. Oh. You start the next one. Don't let that happen again. No. I'm so sorry. It's so hard to know. But yeah, thank you for taking the time. I realize it's a bit of a deeper conversation, and I'm not sure we always live with that meaning and purpose. And all of us, none of us know how long we have here. And so it's interesting to think about doing it. I worked at a car dealership once, and there was this wonderful young female employee, actually. She was a leader, and she was awesome. And that was one of the things she reflected on in a communication we had going back and forth, and how she doesn't want to wait until something happens in her life to live with intention and purpose. She wanted to do it now. And it was the same thing with the group of ER docs I worked with as well. That was definitely a theme I came up with. So knowing who you are, it's about knowing what makes your heart sing and what energizes you and what gets in the way of that. And knowing who you are as well. Oh my gosh, look at this. It's another female athlete from Manitoba. That's so weird. So this is Monica Fife. As a 15-year-old, she was on the Commonwealth Games team and won a gold medal for our country and started traveling around the world on a World Cup circuit. And so another really awesome, strong female leader. And what was interesting with this athlete, and again, I had the privilege of learning so much from everyone I work with, because she was a young athlete and she was traveling around in a sport, she shot air rifle, if you're wondering what this is. And it was actually a bit ironic. I lived in the States and moved back, and I worked with an athlete who shot guns. I was like, what? Okay. But as she was so young and her sport's very stoic, she sometimes was very good on the World Cup circuit, and sometimes she struggled a lot more. In one competition where she was really struggling, another shooter sat down beside her because he could tell she was in a very tough spot, not happy about her performance. And he, sat down with her, and they were sitting beside each other just talking about things. She came back to Canada, and I asked her, oh, what did you guys talk about? And she goes, well, at first, not much. Then he looked at me and he said, do you know who you are? And I'm like, oh, well, what did you say? And apparently she said, I have no idea. And he said, oh, well, you need to figure that out. You need to know who you want to be every time you step into the line. Only when you know who you want to be are you going to recognize when you're not in that spot. And I was like, oh, can you sit with him at the next event? Like, sounds like a pretty cool guy. But since then, in sport, we'll sometimes talk about ideal performance state and all that fun stuff, and I think that that's a much richer concept. Who do you want to be? Who do you want to be when you head into work? Who do you want to be at the end of the day when you meet your family? Who do you want to be as a parent? Who do you want to, I just love that idea of knowing who you are and knowing who you want to be. And in sport, we spend a lot of time doing stuff like that. This is obviously a very skeleton version of what really happens, but basically they do a lot of assessments to see what kind of body people have, because they know how it's going to change and how we can do gaps and all that. We don't try and override it. If you're an ectomorph, we're not going to treat you like an endomorph. That doesn't make sense, right? We're going to honor the fact that you're built like this, and we're going to make this body strong. And what's really interesting is trying to expand that and think a little bit about kind of who you are and how you're wired. And this just reminds me of the idea of vulnerability. And we all are, we all have things that kind of scare us and that make us vulnerable. And that takes a lot of energy. And it's important for us to identify what those things are, so that we aren't like this individual who doesn't want to get out of bed, but instead we're someone who's ready to attack it. Imagine if we woke up in the morning and thought about our day ahead, and we thought about the fact that, okay, what's going to be stressful today? Oh, that tough conversation with that person is going to be really hard for me. Okay, how do I want to handle that? Who do I want to be in that situation? Okay, yeah, that's how I want to handle my part. Okay, that's very empowering. Instead of worrying about it all day, we're ready for it, and we're ready to be who we want to be in those moments. There's a really interesting research study that this picture reminds me of, where they had people identify, there's a bunch of adjectives, and they had to write down which adjectives most define them. And then they split the group into two, and one half of the group had on a screen like this the adjectives flashed up that defined them while they did physical testing, and the other half of the group had just random adjectives up there. And the group that was looking at adjectives that defined them, they actually did better on every physical test that took place. And when they looked, they did a functional MRI, stuck them in a little functional MRI, and they looked at the brain, and they're like, oh, when we do that, the brain's working as a functional anatomical unit. There's some emotion, there's some cerebral cortex, there's like a balance in the head. Oh, that's interesting, And again, it's this idea of being who we are. There's some contexts and some settings where we're not who we are. We have to be, if we're more extroverted and I'm in an introverted setting, or vice versa, that will just take me more energy. And again, if we have that attitude of understanding who we are and looking at it non-judgmentally, just as information, we can take care of ourselves and we can be well. If we don't, we can be tired and we can be hard on ourselves for being tired. So it's really important to take care of ourselves in those situations. And if we do that, if we're honest and we accept ourselves unconditionally, there's actually a really neat person. Her name's Kristen Neff. It's Neff. And she has a website called selfcompassion.org, and she's a researcher in the United States, and she has tons of free resources on her website. And she talks a lot about a concept of self-compassion, which is basically being nice to yourself. But it's gone viral. It's very, because a lot of people don't do it, I guess. But it's very good. But if we know what we need, right? This flower knows what it needs to thrive. It gets its water, it's got its light. And look, it looks, if you look around the flower, it looks like it's not going to do very well. It's thriving. It's getting it done. Another part of knowing who you are is knowing who's on your team. And again, these are amazing situations. You know, this is a wheelchair basketball team. And this is a team that went to the Paralympic Games in London and was absolutely devastated. They did not achieve their goals. It was one of the most heartbreaking sport experiences I think I've been part of. They had to go to World Championships a few years later, and they realized they kind of lost their way. And they recognized that what they wanted to do was three things. They wanted to love the game, they wanted to embrace the challenge, and the one that was most important for them was they wanted to stay family. And it's really important to know who your family is. And family isn't always biological, but who's really on your team. Who are you honest with about when it's a hard day? Who do you talk to? This is Team Crothers after they were making the Olympic trials. Curling in Canada is really hard to qualify to get the Olympic Games. If you make it out of there, you're going to do very well. And this was a situation where Reed had thrown a great stone, and they needed to win that game to advance to the playoffs, and it looked like it was going to happen. And the other skip, had a hero shot, and the dream was over. And the lead of the team came down to the other ice and helped his skip down the ice, right? Because he knew how hard that would be on him. And this is Sarah Pavin and her partner, actually her former partner, I believe, but playing basketball. So in sport, we have these clear lines of who is and isn't on our team, and in life, we certainly have a sense of who we value and who's on our team. And I can definitely say Harris, he said I was a member, I just call myself a member of the Harris family. He said a friend. But certainly, having people like that on my team really helped me to stay mentally well. They went on a family vacation this summer that was a little long for me. So I had a bit of time where I had to work through things on my own, and that was a little rough for Adrienne. So certainly as soon as Donna returned, I certainly had a long conversation about the various things that were going on that I needed to deal with in order to stay mentally well. But I'm glad they had fun. So the next thing we're going to watch is a really short clip, and this is a TED Talk that went viral. And it's with Brene Brown. And this is just a 5-minute version of it. And she talked about the idea of vulnerability. And since then, she's gone on. She has lots of books. I think one is like Daring Greatly or Living Greatly. She has all these fun things. And what I love about this concept is the idea that, the best things in life are in places where we're vulnerable. And it's really hard to let ourselves be vulnerable sometimes. But at the end of our lives, and I remember there was this Jimmy Valvano. Basketball was my main sport in university, and I was very involved. And Jimmy V was a basketball coach, and they have an annual event now to raise money for cancer. He passed away from cancer. And he's probably one of the most energetic, typical basketball coach, lots of energy. But if you watch his clip, it just oozes out there, and he's like, every day, if you laugh, and if you cry, and if you use your brain, that is a good day. And he's so passionate about it. And at that point in his life, he had so much clarity about what a good day was, because he only had so many good days left. And so again, you laugh, you cry, you think that's a good day. And those are things where we're emotional, and we're raw, and we're real, and we protect ourselves so much that we don't always have those vulnerable moments. So we'll just do a little quick clip on that, and then we're gonna distribute some paper. I don't really know how to make it work though. Kylo? No, just maybe I should click on it. Do you think? As you think about your question.
As a dark emotion. There are a lot of things when we talk about positive emotions, negative emotions, dark emotions, light emotions. We think of vulnerability as a dark emotion. We think of it as the core of fear and shame and grief and disappointment, uncertainty, things that we do not want to feel, right? Things that I don't want to be vulnerable because that means I'm afraid, that means I'm uncertain, that means I'm at risk, I'm exposed, I'm in grief. So what we do is we armor up and we say, I do not want to slip into these dark emotions. I will not let myself be vulnerable. But here's what I learned from the research and certainly put into motion in my own life that was the most life-changing is that vulnerability is the center of difficult emotion. But it's also the birthplace of every positive emotion that we need in our lives. Love, belonging, joy, empathy. How many of you would agree that we're in a serious empathy deficit in our culture today? Totally, right? No vulnerability, no empathy. In a culture where people are afraid to be vulnerable, you can't have empathy. You know, empathy is not a default response. If you share something with me that's difficult, in order for me to be truly empathic, I have to step into what you're feeling. And that's vulnerable. So there can be no empathy without vulnerability. Why do you think, in that example that I used a while ago, daughter comes home and says, tears, no one sat with me at lunch today. They made fun of what I was wearing. So-and-so won't talk to me. They poured my books out of my locker. And the response back is, I told you, I bought you all those cute jeans. Why aren't you wearing those jeans? And pull your hair back. Is that an empathic response? No, it's a shaming response. Could that shaming response be could a mother who absolutely adores her child respond with that shaming response? Please say yes, don't kid yourself. I mean, come on. If you're a parent sitting in here, then you sure as hell know the answer to that is yes. But why? Why did that happen? Where was the access to vulnerability? Where was empathy? You can't access empathy if you're not willing to be vulnerable. So if my daughter comes home and tells that to me, guess what I have to do? I have to reactivate that sweaty palmed 7th grader who lives inside me. And I have to go, oh God, that's so hard. I'm so sorry. That's happened to me. That's happened to me when I was in middle school, and it's happened to me last week. Let's talk about it. But you can't get there without vulnerability. You can't fake empathy. Innovation and creativity, born of vulnerability. This is my favorite part. I talked about this I did another TED Talk this year in Long Beach, and I told the story that during 2011, and even this year, after the big TEDx Houston talk went viral, the big calls came from Fortune 500 companies. Oh my God, we loved your TED Talk. It was great. Please come talk to all of our senior leaders. And it's like, okay, what do you want to talk about? Like, we don't care. Just come and talk to us. Just if you could ixnay the shame and vulnerability talk. Every single conversation, barring maybe 10%. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, we love, you're funny, you have this great research, I think there's a real fit with what we do. We don't really do, that kind of stuff around here, so if you could not mention vulnerability and shame. So just for fun, for grins, I would say, okay, so what would you like me to talk about? Yeah, fourth quarter earnings, like, frickin' don't even balance my checkbook. I'm not gonna talk about that. So, what do you want me to talk about? Well, the big issue, creativity and innovation. And change, we're going through a lot of change. Okay, so vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, innovation, and change. And the reason that crisis is happening is because you're not talking about vulnerability. Imagine creativity and innovation without vulnerability. I'm asking you for a work product that has never been made before, that's completely innovative. I need you to be creative, and I need you to present it to a group of people who are going to half of them think it's stupid and not understand it. No vulnerability there.
Okay, so that's Brene Brown. So actually, I gave you the 3 questions. You can do that, or you can just write down a few things that resonated for you from this clip. Really, we just want to talk about vulnerability for the next few minutes. That was actually, to be honest, a different clip than I was anticipating, but I liked it. I've never seen it before, but it was great. So, so you can, you know, again, you can just think about it I just want you to talk about vulnerability as your group and jot a few notes down, so then we can, like, as a big group, see a couple things that came out of each of the group discussions. So you can talk about my little concrete way of doing it, of what is vulnerability, what's scary, and, you know, how do I do it? Or you can just talk about, hey, what resonated for me from that video? Okay, there you go. 5 minutes. I'm wondering, rather than have every table say something, because I just don't know if we have the time for that, I'm sort of wondering if we can get someone on that side of the room just to say something that they found interesting or that really resonated for them that they had in their group discussion, and then we'll have someone on this side of the room as well. So anyone on that side who's willing to share something that came up in their small group discussion that they think the larger group might find interesting or would benefit from? Yes?
Being open to failure.
Ah, yes, being open to failure, absolutely. And that is a concept. You'll see there's a slide that says you have failed coming up. You know, talking about that, and Kurt Tribble, my heart surgeon, talked a lot about that. When he emails residents that come through, do they want to be a cardiothoracic surgeon? First question he asks them is, so what are you going to do when you screw it up? Because he knows that if you're sitting in that chair ready to become a cardiothoracic surgeon, you probably haven't screwed up a lot in your lifetime. And he knows that how you deal with that is going to determine whether you're going to be successful in your residency, right? So failure is incredibly important. And someone actually asked Kurt after his talk, put up their hand, you know, and they said, what do you do when you lose a patient? Because that's his job. And he said, you know what, I had to figure out a way to deal with that. If I didn't figure out a way to deal with that, then I couldn't keep being a cardiothoracic surgeon. And he said, for me, it was remember and forgive. So if I lose a life, I spend time reflecting on that operation so I can honor their life by becoming a better doctor moving forward, and then I forgive myself. And he's like, the latter was hard to learn how to do. And they're like, do you do that after every operation? He's like, actually, I do that after every stitch. I have very high standards to myself, and if I do a stitch I don't like and I have an emotional reaction, I have to let go of the emotions so I can learn and keep being a better doctor throughout that operation. And I was like, that's an interesting thing, because failure has a lot of emotional weight to it, doesn't it? And having some sort of process where we can remember and forgive, learn and get better, and stand on the foundation of that, I think is a very powerful concept. So I agree with that a lot. Okay, what's something on this side of the room?
Vulnerable people.
Yeah, be vulnerable, people. Come on.
I think we mentioned back here that vulnerability takes practice. Like you have to, and it takes a lot of patience. Like
Yeah, I love that. It takes practice, right? And recognizing that when we start to do something, we're not going to master it right away. And so that's where that patience comes from. And I also think of that Kristen Neff self-compassion stuff. You know, being kind to ourselves where we mess it up, you know, and making sure to come back. I do highly recommend the longer TED Talk that Brene Brown has. If people have not seen it, it has gone a bit viral. So a lot of people have seen it. But quite honestly, every time I even I thought, oh yeah, that's good stuff. I forgot about that. You know, every time you read it. And what I like is she's very honest about the fact that she's human, and it's tough to live vulnerably. Like even though she's done all the research, it's really hard. And in her talk, she talks about the reason why she did the research on vulnerability, because she doesn't like being vulnerable, so she thought maybe she could control it a little better. And she's like, but that didn't end well, you know? She told her friend that she was doing the research a little stressed out. She's going to go to a therapist, and her friend was giving her recommendations. Of, well, I don't envy that therapist. And she's like, what does that mean? You know? So, yeah, it's tough for sure. All right. So something that's interesting, too, is to reflect a little bit on, you know, when we think about the experiences that have shaped us. And it's interesting sometimes, you know, if you just draw on your paper like a line that's like neutral emotion, and what were the highs and lows in your life? What are the experiences that you remember? Because those things shape us, but those are also things that, you know, similar to remember and forgive, there's sometimes that we hold on to things. And when we think about being emotionally well, sometimes we hold on to things and it can build up. And so it's interesting just to reflect a little bit on, you know, where we've come from and how that kind of stuff impacts us. So that's the idea of knowing who you are. The next one is the fact that we're a human being. Okay, I put a male athlete in there, you know, Tyler Mislichuk, he's doing like really well right now. I don't know if anyone, like, I always read the paper because I'm reading athletes and seeing what they say. And Tyler recently, they had the test event in Tokyo for his sport, and he actually won it. So the first time a Canadian's on the men's side has won in triathlon. He's also won a WTS this year, so he's doing amazing. And obviously, for someone in an endurance sport, when we look at the face at the end, you literally have to go all in and give everything you have in order to make it happen, and recognize that you're a human being throughout the way. So, as human beings, there's certain principles that happen to us, right? And I have a colleague, and his name is Peter Jensen, and he was actually in town with the basketball team recently. He's just wonderful at what he does. And in one of his books, he talks about a story with basketball, and there was a basketball player, and he was feeling a lot of pressure because he was a very talented player. There were a lot of recruits or scouts watching him, and he was just feeling a lot of pressure, and he was talking to his coach about it. So his coach threw him a basketball, and he said to the player, "Does it work?" And the player was like, "Well, what do you mean, does it work?" And he's like, "Bounce it." So he bounces it, and it bounces back up. So the coach grabs the basketball from him and slashes it and takes the air out of it. And he says, "Does it work now?" And the player's kind of thinking his coach has lost it a little bit. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, "Bounce it." Goes to bounce it, and it just sits on the ground. And the coach is like, "Well, why didn't it work?" And the player's like, "Well, there's no air in the ball now." And he's like, pressurized air. He's like, if you think about it, he's like, pressurized air, it creates pressure, it creates energy, and so when you're feeling pressure, it does that, it creates energy. And so he went on to talk to the player about the fact that you have a basketball and you got a PSI, you press per square inch that you like, and when it's too much pressure, you drain it, and you have to identify what your pressure per square inch is. But it's interesting to think of that in the context of life. And there's sometimes where we have a lot of pressure on us. If you don't take care of that, if you don't pay attention to it, that can keep you up at night. It can get you more responsive or reactive in certain situations. And we're all different. So understanding the things that impact us in the phases of our life where we might be under more pressure, and how do we help ourselves stay emotionally well? I love the analogy of, with a house, and we do a lot of time analyzing a house and where we lose energy and things that affect it. We do all sorts of things to keep it well. We have thermostats in our house, so we can manage what the temperature is going to be. You don't want to be someone who's a thermometer. You walk into a situation, you become whatever's happening around you. You want to know what your temperature is, what your leaking points are, what you want to do to stay where you want. And imagine if we spent the amount of time analyzing where our energy comes from and where our energy leaks out of, and where we need to put processes in place to manage that. There's even really fancy thermometer or temperature now, thermostats, I think is the word, yeah. Even fancier thermostats now where we can regulate it in. But imagine if we approached our life that way, and we were honest about ourselves in terms of the things that are tough on us and where our energy is going to be leaked out. There's certain situations we have to be in, so how are we going to recover from that? And imagine if we had due diligence in the way that we take care of our belongings. It'd be a pretty cool thing. In terms of being human, knowing what you want to focus on at the right time is very important, and as is staying connected to the process. The number one person we hear from most of the day is ourselves. So that can either be a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose. But it's an interesting concept. I'm a big believer in mindfulness. For myself personally, I like hot yoga. I find that my blend is about 2 or 3 times a week. If I don't do that, I probably will get sick. But we all have a place. I have one athlete right now. Her goal was to do meditation. She hated it. And so she decided to go for 10-minute walks by herself because she just wanted to be alone with her thoughts, and that was a way easier way to do it. So again, it's just paying attention to the fact that we've got a lot going on in our head, and how do we manage what's up there. This is that self-compassion theory that I was talking about with Kristen Neff. It's N-E-F-F. She has incredible free resources on her website. She has meditations you can do. She has reflections you can do. She's very, very generous with that. And these are the 3 components of it. Being mindful, being kind, and recognizing that other people have experienced this as well. And that when we have that sense of community around the tough experiences we're having, it can be very, very helpful. This is the idea of the mind-body connection. So this is the reality of what's happening inside our body. This is called biofeedback equipment, neurofeedback equipment. And it's attached to all the modalities that deal with like stress and anxiety in our body. And so over here, you'll notice this blue line here. That's someone's breathing. And the red is someone's heart rate. And you'll notice they're not really synced up or lined up. Over here, you'll notice that they're lined up. You'll notice here the skin temperature is a little bit different. Hands are a little warmer here. You'll notice that we have more skin conductance or sweat here. So basically, we don't know it, but when we're carrying stress and tension around in our body, inside our body, this is what's happening. This isn't a person who's anxious. This is someone that doesn't have good heart rate variability. This is someone who's calm. So when I do biofeedback stuff with my athletes, what's really interesting is there's something called the biofeedback stress test. And someone will do like mental math in their head, or they'll think about a stressful situation, and then they'll do that for a minute, and then they'll recover for a minute, and then we'll do the next task. Once they're done with the mental math, like the math doesn't exist anymore. The only way it exists is what they're telling themselves in their head. And it's really interesting because some people recover. Other people hold on to it. And the people who hold on to it, those are the people that, their mental well-being, depending on life, the life load and what happens can really impact how mentally well we are. So it's just interesting. What I like about biofeedback equipment is it shows us what's happening inside our body in terms of how we're doing with our stress and anxiety response. For my athletes, I want them to perform on demand. I want them to understand and be able to let go of things and have restful sleep at night, because I know if they're sleeping restfully leading up, they're going to be better able to handle the stress and pressure that's inevitable. And I also want them to be able to refocus and reset in the moment, be honest about what this feels like and recognize when they're doing it so they can let it go and move on. And it's just the way we are. We're human beings. Our brain was put in our head to help us survive. We have a polyvagal nerve, a fast nerve that goes up to our brain when things are stressful for us. That's the way our body was made. That's being a human being. And so it's a matter of understanding that so that we can manage it, so that we can stay well. Life can be tough for sure. So one of the things that's really important is to prioritize recovery. This is just a road sign that was on the internet when I did a presentation. It's one of my other colleagues who's awesome, Joey Jensen, was the one that came up with this one. Donna has a great one that she took as a family on another family trip that they never took me on when they went up to Tofino. And there's a sign that says, what does it say? Stress-free zone.
Stress-free zone, 8 kilometers.
Yeah,
relax and disconnect.
Yeah, and so that's another great sign out there. But it's this idea of, once again with technology, we pay attention to things that drain our battery. And we've got lots of cues. We're going to charge our battery to full capacity before we use it. Keep away from high temperatures. Know when to recharge it. Disable it once it's fully charged. Recharging it before we let our battery run out. Isn't that interesting? Some pretty good life advice from this whole battery care. Sometimes we don't have time to go to Tofino. We don't have time to drive 8 kilometers and however many hours before that to get there. So maybe it's not so much as finding a destination to recover, but how do we weave it into our lives that we have? This is another, Kaylee Humphreys, I guess. She's competing for America now. Wonderful person though, unfortunate. I'll have to remove her, I guess, I don't know. Poor Kaylee, she's a very close friend of mine. It's this idea of using the pauses. And so Kurt, I still remember when he got home, he flew home, had been busy doing talks for us the whole time, landed, and there was an emergency in his town, and then they needed another person in the OR. So he literally lands and goes in the operating room, he's done. But one of the things he spoke about was in the course of his day, there's 2 paths to get to the operating room, and one path goes by natural light. So whenever possible, he always walks by the natural light, because for him, that's energizing. And so sometimes it's not a destination, but how do we weave recovery into the context of our daily lives? That is Kurt Tribble right there, people. And this is just a natural light that he walks by. This is the failure slide that I've already spoken to. And if you Google, Kurt's name is with a C. It's C-U-R-T and then T-R-I-B-B-L-E. And he has, I think actually his talk he did here is probably on YouTube somewhere. But he also has a really neat interview that someone did with him a number of years ago where he talks about, about the concept that I was talking about and recovering from failure. This is him talking about, you do not get too many chances to get that stitch just right. I learned under the conditions that I had to incorporate the concept of remember and forgive into the microcosms of seconds. It was my goal to be able to analyze it, learn from it, remember that lesson, and forgive myself if I didn't like the outcome. Deal with that emotion, move on, and keep trying to be better. You have to be able to focus on the next stitch entirely without losing the lesson that you learned from this one. And so I think that's a pretty powerful way of living and a pretty powerful way of being. And what was really interesting when he was here, we did a grand rounds at Health Sciences Center. And there was an anesthesiologist who was talking about an experience they had when they were a resident, like probably a decade, many, many years ago. And as he was talking about it, he was very emotional in talking about it. And one of the other doctors kind of spontaneously stood up, who was in the theater watching, and just said, you know what? If you don't have experiences like that, you're not a real doctor. And it's interesting, we talk about the vulnerability and how failure lives it, and ultimately we want to be willing to live a vulnerable life where we do make mistakes and we do learn and we do get better, because if not, we're not striving and we're not trying to be great. And there's an African-American poet named Maya Angelou, and often when I talk with my athletes about it, I'll connect it to her story. And she wrote an autobiography, and when she was at her press release, one of the reporters through the conversation was asking her if she wished some of those things never happened to her, because she had some very difficult experiences that she had shared in this book. And she paused for a moment and said, I don't will any of those experiences away. Every experience I've had has created the wise woman who sits before you today. And so I love that idea of changing our relationship with our life experiences and with our failures and with our moments that we wish that we did better, instead of them becoming burdens that we carry around, rather becoming lessons and experiences that we stand upon, so that we can be who we want, even more so in those moments in the future. So I love that idea. The next thing, we have a handout that we're going to hand out to you, and it's mental health continuum. So we were talking about being mentally well, and it's sometimes hard to really operationally define what that is. And the Canadian Mental Health Association was thinking of you folks, and so they made this continuum. And it looks at sort of signs and indicators, and once again, just like everyone, when we drew the faces, everyone was different because we're all unique people. When we look at mental health, we're all unique people in terms of when we're well and how we can tell we're well, when we're struggling, and when we're really having a tough time and we really need to take a step back. And when I talk about this, I talk about it in an empowering way, so that, again, it's not judgmental. It's looking at it for understanding. And one of the things they suggest is to identify what the important things are in your life. And years ago, there was sort of a thing going around the internet, and there was a professor in the front of a class, and he had a glass jar, and he had kind of big rocks, and he put big rocks into it and asked the class, is it full? And the class looked and said, yeah, it looks full, because the rocks came up to the rim. Then the professor took out sand and dumped all the sand in, and then water in, and finally, is it full? And it was. And he said, what's the lesson? And you can look at it many ways, but the lesson that I'm connecting it to right now that he spoke about is the idea that you have to know what the rocks are in your life, and you have to get them in early, because otherwise sand and water and all the other stuff's going to fill it up, and it's really hard to get it in at the end. So when we think about mental health and mental well-being, it is really important to identify what are your rocks? What are the important things in your life that are going to keep you well? In my experience, when we get really busy and stressed and things start happening, that's when that stuff goes, because we don't have time for it. But I wonder if it's really the opposite. That's when we actually have to make sure it happens, because that's going to help us to sustain as we handle the load that we're under right now. So it's really interesting. So we'll get those to you. They're just up there, and we'll give those to you so you can start to look at, how do you know when I'm vibrant, I'm doing really well right now, and what do I notice about that? And what are my red flags? What are the signs that I'm not who I want? Is it that I'm not as patient when I'm hanging out with my kid and they're having a tough day at school? Is it that, but it's different for everyone. And it's a really powerful tool if we start to think about it that way. And it's one of the first tools that I've seen that really, I think, does a great job of capturing the idea of mental well-being. And once again, physically we understand it, but from a mental well-being and mental health perspective, it's different. And we're all different. I mentioned that we all have brains in our head, and we're all different in terms of how our body processes stress and anxiety and what it focuses on. And this isn't about judging or wishing we were something else. It's about honoring who we are and how we were made, and learning how to manage that so that we can be the best versions of ourselves more often. What's really interesting is that when we're mentally well, we have so much better perspective. And we're able to live with meaning and purpose and vibrancy. And this is one of my athletes from many years ago. She's on the LPGA tour now. Her name's Brittany Marchand, and she had some really tough stuff happen off the golf course, including losing some very, very important people in her life. And she's an overachiever. Well, she went to North Carolina State and did an engineering degree and 2 different kinds of engineering while she was on a golf scholarship. And she's an incredible human being that's never been slowed down in her lifetime. But life gave her some challenges that she had to, and so she was saying that, I know I've learned a lot about this in the past few years, about how taking care of myself, making sure I take time for myself is so important for feeling the best on and off the course. When I feel good with my life around me, that's when I play my best. And again, in sport, we have those indicators where we can tell when we are or are not in that place. And wouldn't it be awesome if we also, because our lives are even more important than the performance on a course, you know? And imagine if we also treated our lives in that manner. When I was younger, my mom always used to, she would read to me at night, and one of the books, she would always cry actually, she was not good at getting through the books. She read the Heidi, and when we read the Heidi story and the grandfather dies, I was like, oh my gosh, Mom, the grandfather's gonna die soon, this is not gonna be good. You know, she'd be like weeping, and you know, one of the stories that she loved was the Velveteen Rabbit. So once again, never made it through the book. She had a rough time, but that's okay. I guess she was very willing to be vulnerable. So I love this part of the Velveteen Rabbit. And you know, what is real? Asked the Velveteen Rabbit one day. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you in a stick-out handle? Real isn't how you are made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you when someone loves you for a long, long time. Not just to play with, but really loves you. Then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. When you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up, he asked, or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily or have sharp edges or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been left off, and your eyes drop out and you're loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always. And so as I'm working with my athletes and talking with my athletes, for me, the journey to whatever their human potential is it's really their process of becoming real. And I think that in my role, I'm just always providing a sounding board and helping them to keep on that path, because there's lots of times where they don't want to be vulnerable anymore, and they're really having trouble wanting to go all in the next race because it really, really hurt badly when they're devastated. Chantel was one of the slides I showed up there, and she was an athlete who wanted to go to the Olympics in London. And she was one of the first hopes we've ever had out of our province. And she went to the Olympic trials, and she, swam the race, and she needed to be top 2 in the country, which she was, but she was 0.01 off the standard, which is the least possible margin that you can have. And so she didn't go to London. She came back to Winnipeg and sat in my office, and she said, I've never seen my dad cry. And as she was talking, I was like trying to keep it together. And what was really interesting is now she's a doctoral student. She's doing her PhD with me. And years later, we did this thing at Vincent Massey, I think it was 2 years ago, when she first come back to Winnipeg. And I was like, at the end of it, I'm like, let's go for lunch. So we went for lunch, and we sat down, and she said, you know what? I knew in that moment that you cared and that you got it. And I was like, oh, okay, she noticed I was almost crying. But, that's how much it hurts. It hurt the whole family when she didn't go. And what we did was I asked her coach for the video of her in that failed race. And we watched that race as many times as we needed to so that she could watch it without any emotion. Because I knew she was young and she was going to try again. And so when she went to Rio and she was standing on the pool deck, someone sent me a picture and it meant a lot to her. So anyways, living resilient. Knowing who you are, embracing your humanity, and prioritizing recovery. Because we all deserve to be great, and we're all kind of doing our own Olympics, whatever that means, in our own way. And I think that's really important. Thank you very much. This is another one of our beautiful athletes, Isabella Onishko, who's another wonderful story. She was the first Canadian in history to qualify for the beam files at the Rio Olympic Games. And for her, she was told she was going to be the first up at the Rio Olympics in the first event they were on the beam. So she had to get herself ready to get on a balance beam. She turned 18, graduated from high school, and made the Olympic team all in the same week. And then she had to go to Rio. And it was really interesting because her mom was someone who is a physiotherapist, and her dad's a medical doctor, and they were sort of like, oh my God, this kid's doing sport, I don't really know what's going on. And there's a CBC interview where her mom was in Rio, and her mom was able to go with her to that event, and the camera sort of interviewed her, and she was about to do her beam final, and the mom was very emotional, and she says, I get it now, I understand, and I didn't know what this moment was like, and it was, again, very beautiful. And these, of course, are some of our wonderful members of our Team Canada hockey team. We have Billy Brown, who lives in Manitoba now, and beside we have, is that Kelly? I think Kelly, Bridget, and then we have Jocelyn the Rock, and Jocelyn been maybe to 3 Olympic Games at this point. And this one here is an unbelievable story, our first Aboriginal person to make the female women's hockey team. And there was GM, or one of the companies, did a beautiful story on her and her family, and what it meant for them, and what her journey like it was there, to get there. So all of these people are unbelievable human beings, and they need to be physically well and they need to be mentally well to reach their potential, and I think all of us do as well. So thank you very much.